flow. Practice in front of that mirror, girls, you twerking it on the dance floor. Practice in front of that mirror, girls, you twerking it on the practice in front of that mirror, girls, you twerking it on the dance floor. Practice in front of that mirror, girls, you twerking it on the floor.
Alright, hey, what's up guys? So since mini cutting is sort of in vogue right now with summer just around the corner and whatever, I figured I would do a quick video just outlining my sort of general thoughts on this and the approach that I usually take. And I'll take you through a couple examples of people who might actually benefit from mini cutting. So in case some of you guys aren't really sure what it is, basically a mini cut differs from a full-blown contest prep diet in its length and sometimes its intensity. So where in a full-blown contest prep diet you would typically take 24 to say 36 weeks and get as lean as you can possibly get. A mini cut is usually shorter and sweeter and probably lasts anywhere from say 2 weeks until 8 weeks. So first let's start with the cases where a mini cut probably wouldn't be appropriate. I don't think you should ever mini cut right after a show. This just doesn't make any sense to me. Even if say you went out and you binged super hard for a full week and you gained 10 pounds or 30 pounds, or I've known guys who've gained 40 pounds in that first week after a show. Even if you fall into this boat, I still think that trying to damage control with a mini cut is more likely to set you up on a sort of yo-yo for the rest of your off season or until you can break that cycle. So I just don't think it's a good habit to get into. If you did happen to find yourself in this place after your competition, I would say that the best thing to do would be to simply increase your water intake, because a lot of that weight that you added, isn't fat weight, it's much more likely water retention that you're experiencing. So increase your water intake and bring your calories back down to a maintenance level and figure out what it is that you need to do so that you just stop binging. If you just stop binging and start eating normally again, then that weight is going to sort of start to go down over time naturally. It's not like you've increased your weight up 30 pounds, so now you're stuck here until you do a cut again. It'll sort of just re-equilibrate if you just stop eating constantly. So I'm going to set the guideline that running a mini cut within 6 months following your competition just isn't a good idea, and it would be a lot smarter to take advantage of this time when your body really is primed for anabolism and take advantage of the good pumps that you're getting in the gym, the increases in strength, and the influx of carbs that you didn't have while you were dieting into your show. Take advantage of this in terms of actually adding some new muscle tissue rather than just spinning your wheels and going from binge to mini cut to binge to mini cut. And also recognize that this is normal, right? I don't know if I know any competitors who haven't at least binged really badly once after a competition. And I've known tons of people who have had extended binges after their competition. So don't be too rough on yourself, don't feel too guilty, accept that it's normal, and then just do your best to just break the binging cycle and go back to normal eating, rather than doing a mini cut. Okay, so moving on to the second scenario where I don't feel as though it is appropriate. And this is the person who might be in the middle of their off season, but they're already very lean. And I'm gonna set the cap here at 10%. So if you're under 10% body fat, then I don't see any good reason why you should be mini cutting. In fact, I would say that you would be better off putting yourself in a caloric surplus, gaining some muscle and gaining some fat so that you can make progress. And this is especially the case for guys who are still relatively new to bodybuilding. If you've only done a show or two and you haven't been training for that long, trying to stay ultra lean all the time might actually hinder your rate of progress, and you'd be better off, staying in a surplus for even the entirety of your off season rather than going through mini cuts just because that's what other people do. And just to get into some specifics here, what I would say to do is if you were, say, 8% body fat, increase your caloric intake until you push yourself up to, say, 10 or 12%. Then you can run a mini cut for a month or so and then build your way back up again. And I just want to say that there's nothing particularly wrong with staying lean in your off season as long as your caloric intake is very high, you're still making progress in the gym, your strength isn't suffering in any sort of way because of the leanness. And I would say that you're also relatively experienced. I don't think that guys who are sort of new to the sport and are still young should be staying that lean, especially if they still have room to increase their calories. And just to be super clear about all of this, I'm not saying that you can't make progress being under 10%. You most certainly can. In fact, you could be in a deficit and under 10% and still make progress if you're progressing in the gym and you're structuring your training properly. But what I am saying is that your rate of progress will probably be hindered if you're spending all this time in a caloric deficit that you could be spending in a caloric surplus. And just as a quick example here, I'm going to show you guys a couple of photos from my second ever bodybuilding competition at the Newfoundland Provincials in 2010. And you'll see in these photos, I actually weighed 139 pounds. And then 2 years later, I competed at the Natural Canadian Nationals, and I weighed in at 151 pounds. And so just to give you guys another look at this, to the far left there, that is me at my very first competition in 2009. I weighed 140 pounds. There in the middle is sort of the transition period where I first began my prep for nationals in 2012, something like 10 weeks out, I believe, and I was around 165 pounds there. And then what you see on the far right is my final package, which if you just compare the chest in the left and right photos and my legs in the left and right photos, and pretty much everything, you just see a world of difference there. And I do attribute that to some degree to my lack of time spent in a mini cut phase. And then this is just another example from the back here. You can see the improvements from 2009 to 2012. I'll admit I am sort of facing a weird angle in the 2009 photo, but the idea here is that you can see significant improvements through the back, and my conditioning actually looks to be better in 2012, and I'm about 10 or 11 pounds heavier there. So that was 12 pounds of stage weight in 2 years. Now I will note that I do think I was a little bit leaner at the first competition in 2010, but it goes to show that, if you compare these two photos, a lot of gains can be made in just a 2-year period. And I didn't run any mini cuts in this period. I was in a surplus the entire time. And I actually went up as high as 40 pounds over my stage weight. So I went from 140 pounds to a peak off-season weight of just over 180 pounds that off-season. And then I cut 30 pounds again down to 151. That might be a little bit more of, let's say, an aggressive approach than I would take now if I were to rewind the clock. But I do really think that a lot of the gains that I've made even to this date come from the progress that I made in those 2 years between 2010 and 2012. And so just to backpedal here a little bit and cover all my bases, I'm not saying that you should just, take 2 years off and just perma-bulk for 2 years and you'll get the same results that I did. But I am saying that, if you spend those 2 years spinning your wheels between, mini cut and gaining phases without any real structure or plan in place, I think you'll probably be limiting your even long-term growth potential to some extent. So now moving on to when it is important and how you might want to employ a mini cut. So I think that there are 2 and maybe 3 main reasons why you would want to mini cut. Okay, so the first example of an instance when I think it would be appropriate is if you've been bulking for a pretty long time and you just have no real appetite anymore and you're finding it difficult to get your calories in and your weight has just become stagnant. In this case, I would say mini cutting might help you get your appetite back up. So just to cite a 2008 study here, following 7 natural bodybuilders over 11 weeks of contest prep, and the researchers measured their blood profile of various different hormones at the 11 weeks out mark, at the 5 weeks out mark, and then again during peak week at the 3-day out mark. And what they basically found was that after 6 weeks of dieting, leptin had significantly decreased and ghrelin had significantly increased. And the net effect of these 2 changes in hormones is that you're just going to get really hungry. Now, interestingly, throughout the next 6 weeks or so, they found that ghrelin went up a little bit. It was like something like 6% from the 5-week out mark. But leptin pretty much just stayed the same for the remaining 6 weeks. So this pretty much tells me that dieting any amount after 6 weeks doesn't probably impact on appetite too much more, right? So after 6 weeks, you're probably super hungry. For the next 6 weeks, you don't necessarily get more hungry, or at least that's what I would infer based on the hormonal results from this study, and it sort of does actually match my own personal experience with dieting. Now, it is worth noting that in the study that I just referenced, the subjects started their cut very lean, which is normal in natural bodybuilding, and I think that their average was 9.6% body fat. So it sort of still remains to be seen whether someone starting at, say, 12 to 15% would experience those same changes in ghrelin and leptin as someone who was starting leaner, and then you could argue whether or not they would experience the same changes in hunger or not. But those are sort of small differences in body fat, and I think that 6 weeks should be more than enough time to increase your hunger if that's your goal. So I still think that putting yourself in a sufficiently large deficit, something like 20 to 25% below maintenance calories, for 2 to 6 weeks should be enough to get your appetite going again, and then you can get on with your sort of bulk or gaining mode or whatever. All right, so I think that the second and probably somewhat more common reason that you might want to mini cut is just to keep your body fat down a little bit. So, it seems to be the case, at least from my observations, that the guys at the top of the natural bodybuilding world right now tend to stay pretty lean in their off season. And they're extremely lean on show day, and the standard for conditioning just continues to go up and up. And so if you find yourself getting too sloppy in your off season, then this might either make life really difficult for you when you have to cut down again, or it might just put a certain level of conditioning out of reach for you for this season. And so I think that mini cuts are a good way to sort of keep progressing in terms of adding muscle in the off season while keeping fat gain at bay. So here I'd like to break it down into two sort of separate examples that you probably fall somewhere on a spectrum between. So the first example is the guy or girl who has always gotten really shredded for their shows. They've never really had a super difficult time getting lean. So for this person, I would say that you can probably get away with holding a little bit more body fat in your off season before it would be prudent to run a mini cut of any sort. So just as an example, for a guy, something like 12 to 15% would serve as like sort of a reasonable high end that you wouldn't want to push yourself over before having to run a mini cut. And now let's imagine a guy or a girl who's historically struggled with getting into shape, maybe hasn't got in fantastic shape in previous shows, or has really had to sort of kill themselves to get there. For this person, I would err towards the side of staying a little bit too lean in your off season, and I probably wouldn't go too much higher than 10 to 12% as the high range of body fatness for your off season. And so without going too far down the rabbit hole with numbers here, I would probably recommend for competitor 1 to just bulk as long as he or she can until you hit that high end of, say, 12 to 15% for guys, and basically get your calories as high as possible and just make as much progress in the gym as you possibly can, and then probably do a little bit of a longer mini cut, something like 5 to 10 weeks, with a slightly smaller deficit, say something like 10 to 15% below maintenance. And then at the end of the 5 to 10 weeks, aim to have lost probably 5 to 10 pounds. And this is obviously going to vary depending on the body weight of the individual, but I'm just giving sort of nice round numbers for you guys as something to hold on to. And if you find that you have to lose much more than this, say 5 or 10 pounds on your mini cut, then you probably pushed it a little bit too far with your bulk to begin with. Okay, and so for competitor 2, so the person who struggles a little bit more with getting lean, I would recommend shorter bulking cycles and then also shorter mini cuts. So something more along the lines of 1 to 2 months of bulking, or very lean bulking, interspersed with more regular but also more aggressive mini cuts. So something like a 20 to 25% deficit for 2 to 3 weeks. And the reason that I separate these two is basically just to show that not everyone has to mini cut in exactly the same way. And to me, it just makes more sense to keep the person who struggles with conditioning a little bit closer to their stage condition with more regular mini cuts to help keep them sort of on track with what is priority for them. And allowing this person's bulk to go on for too long could probably result in too much fat accrual. And then in order to get back into that sort of 10 to 12% range, the mini cut might just turn into a full-blown long-term cut. which might actually hinder progress over the long term since you spend less time actually in a slight surplus gaining. And conversely, giving the person who gets into shape quite easily too many mini cuts might actually cause them to spin their wheels, as 1 to 2 months of bulking might actually not be enough time for them to make significant progress, given the nature of their metabolism and whatever else. All right, so on to how should you actually set up the deficit. So should you use cardio or should you use caloric restriction through diet? To me, it probably doesn't really matter, but I would err on the side of doing less cardio, just because generally I find it to be less reliable than dietary caloric restriction in terms of actually tracking the calories that have been expended. And also, if you do it a little bit too much or with too much intensity, at some point it probably will interfere with your recovery and your performance with weight training. So you can feel free to use a combination, but I would use cardio somewhat sparingly, just like I would on any cut. Especially if you plan on using high intensity varieties of cardio. And the very last thing that I will touch on here is this idea of a transition or a hardening phase. Guys who have been around the industry for a while will probably know that some of the ideas I've used in this video would have been borrowed from Lyle McDonald or Lane Norton and adapted a little bit, in some cases not adapted. And I think it was Lyle who talked about this idea of a hardening phase. So basically, at the end of your mini cut, you just spend 2 weeks at maintenance before going back into a surplus. And then similarly, after you finish your bulking phase and you're ready for a mini cut, take 2 weeks, spend them at maintenance, then go into your mini cut. And I don't personally think that this is altogether necessary, and I can't really think of any good reason why it would have any physiological benefit. But it might potentially help you adapt to the change in calories a little bit better. So, if you're used to eating 4,000 calories a day and now all of a sudden you're eating 3,000 or 3,200 calories per day, this reduction in food intake might sort of, catch you off guard, and you might be more likely to maybe cheat on your diet than if you spent 2 weeks, say at 3,600, then went all the way down and started your mini cut. It might help with adherence a little bit, but other than that, I can't really think of any significant physiological reason to follow this protocol. All right, so I almost forgot the third reason why it might be reasonable to do a mini cut, and that is if you just want to get lean for summer. So some people might think that this is sort of like a superficial reason, but a lot of people who follow bodybuilding articles and videos and whatever probably don't even really care that much about the stage. So if you've been bulking for your off season and now you want to do a mini cut for the summer, then that might work just fine for you. So what I would do in this case is just set yourself up in a nice deficit of 10 to 25% below maintenance, depending on how much time you have. Given that it's almost June, we're starting to run out of time, so you might want to err towards the upper end of that range. But keep in mind that the greater the deficit, the more likely you are to compromise lean mass loss. So that's why it's always better to give yourself a little bit more time if you're planning on getting very lean. And so this approach, of course, is obviously much more up to personal preference, depending on how lean you want to get, how much time you want to give yourself, and so on. And so for this person, it might not matter if 2 years down the road they have significant improvements, say in their upper chest for the stage. It might just be a matter of, I want to get below 10% for summer, and so you have a little bit more leeway there, in my opinion. All right, so that's basically it. That's all I have to say on mini cutting. If you guys have any questions for me or anything I didn't address, you can feel free to comment below. And I just want to say that I hope it wasn't, I don't think it came across like this, but I want to make it clear that I don't think that mini cutting is going to kill your gains, or that you can't make progress while in a deficit, or you can't stay lean and still make progress. Clearly, the top guys in natural bodybuilding are staying very lean in their off season, and they're still making progress. So I definitely don't think that is true, but I do think that especially a lot of the younger guys out there, if you're doing all these mini cuts, you're probably going to be stalling your progress, and you might even compromise some of your long-term gains because you really are primed for growth in these initial periods of your training. And in my experience, after my first couple of shows, I didn't run any mini cuts in those off seasons. I just took advantage of all of that growth potential, and I think that I maximized on it. So yeah, that's my thoughts on that. If you like the video, guys, feel free to like it and subscribe if you haven't. Thanks.